I mentioned, so by implementing priority bus treatments along specific corridors, and then also moving to a consistent schedule throughout the day. So currently we have typically a peak hour schedule, and then that schedule may change during the non-peak time on weekdays, and then weekends may be a different scenario. So instead of having different frequency levels throughout the day, we're looking to move to a more consistent schedule so that you'll know on this specific route, the bus is coming every 10 or 15 minutes and so on. In addition to that, we're looking at how we can increase access throughout the region. So providing more frequent service. And so the goal established through Envision My Ride is improving the number of routes or increasing the number of routes that operate every 15 minutes or better. But then also the long-term vision is making sure that all bus routes come at 30 minutes or less. In addition to that, adding new crosstown connections to new destinations, and then also helping to improve first and last mile connectivity through on-demand microtransit solutions. And I'll define that in all of these in a few slides as well. And then also, in addition to that, looking at how we can enhance overall experience by improving the bus stop, and then also rolling out mobility hub improvements throughout the network. And so starting with some of the things that we're recommending for improving time. And so system-wide, we'll be looking at how we can implement priority bus treatments. And so we'll be looking at implementing signal priority through all of our intersections that are managed by our partner agency at the city, known as CDOT, or the Charlotte Department of Transportation. So at all of our corridors where CDOT manages the intersection, we're currently retrofitting our buses so that we'll be able to communicate with traffic signals known as signal priority. And if you look at the graphic at the top, on the top right side, this is an example of signal priority. And so how that works is once a bus approaches the intersection, if it's running behind schedule, it can either advance or extend the green light so it can clear the intersection and continue to its destination. In addition to that, I mentioned the consistent frequency-based schedules. So instead of having different frequency levels throughout the day, moving to a more consistent frequency pattern so that you know the bus is coming every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes, and so on specific routes. In addition to that, we've identified focus corridor improvements, which I'll get to in the next slide. But we looked at additional treatments that we could begin to roll out on these specific corridors. And so those include signal priority at additional locations, and then also queue jumps, which you can see at the lower right hand graphic. And so how a queue jump works is the bus approaches the intersection, then it pulls into a dedicated space and gets a specialized signal. So it can essentially jump ahead of stalled traffic at the intersection. And so with that, we have several recommendations for queue jump locations along specific focus corridors as well. And then also bus stop adjustments so that we can help improve dwell time as we travel along corridors as well. And so I mentioned the focus corridors. And so we evaluated the routes that we identified as a part of the future high frequency network, which is just over 20 routes in total. And so with that, we identified 6 high priority routes that we begin with by using metrics such as bus delay, so identifying where we had routes, we were experiencing periods of delay along the congested corridors, and then also looking at other metrics, so connecting, of course, to employment opportunities, and then also population density as well. And then in addition to that, looking at how we can meet equity goals and other goals as established through the Charlotte 24 Comprehensive Plan and other area plans as well. And so with this, we identified 6 routes or corridors that will be the focus corridors for this study. And so those include, and these are listed based on how they ranked in those categories above. They include routes 9 Central Avenue, Route 7 Beatties Ford Road, Route 16 South Tryon, Route 27 Monroe Road, Route 34 Freedom Drive, and Route 2 Ashley Scaley-Bark, which provides a crosstown connection between the Scaley-Bark station and the Freedom Drive area. And so although we're initially starting with 6 corridors, the goal is to use these recommendations to help inform treatments that we can begin to roll out on additional corridors throughout the network. And so some future corridors that we'll be looking at for priority treatments include Providence Road, West Boulevard, Wilkinson Boulevard, Statesville Road, and Graham Street, just to name a few. And so what we looked at for the signal priority and queue jump recommendations are periods where we have slow speed, both from a bus standpoint and also a vehicle standpoint. And so using September through December data from 2019 for bus speed, we identify segments where we have slower speed at or below 12 miles per hour in a specific corridor. To supplement the data, we also looked at vehicle speed using October 2019 data. And so with that, we looked at periods where individuals' average vehicle speed was at or below 15 miles per hour. And so that helped to inform some of the locations for the signal priority and queue jump recommendations on the focus corridors. I do want to say also that the queue jump recommendations on the focus corridors are using existing right turn lanes. So we are evaluating the future need for additional right-of-way at other intersections. But right now, the recommendations that you will see are at intersections where we have existing right turn lanes where we can take advantage of the queue jump locations there. In addition to that, I also mentioned bus stop adjustments. And so one of the main things that we'll be doing to take advantage of signal priority is shifting bus stops so that they're on the far side of the intersection where feasible. And so how this works is as the bus is approaching the intersection, it'll be able to take advantage of signal priority. And so that'll allow it to clear the intersection and then pick up and drop off passengers at the bus stop. And that way it's not being held up at the traffic light. And that's a way so that we can get to the destination and get individuals to their destination in a quicker manner. In addition to that, we'll also be taking a look at spacing along the corridors. And so we're recommending to have bus stop space at roughly a quarter mile or just over 1,300 feet. And that's based on industry best practices. And so typically how that works is we'll have bus stop space at about a quarter mile. Of course, we'll have exceptions. So if there's a major destination, such as a grocery store or a medical facility, of course, we'll evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. But the reason why we're looking at making bus stop adjustments is so that we can improve dwell time delay. And that's the amount of time it takes buses to pick up and drop off passengers. And so instead of having a bus stop maybe every block, shifting that to every other block so that we can help space that out and improve dwell time for our buses. Next, moving on to some of the things that we're looking at for increasing access. And so with that, we're looking at making system-wide improvements. And so the map that you see here on the right are all of the routes that were identified in Envision My Ride for future high frequency service. And so all of these routes will have 15-minute or better service as we begin to implement Envision My Ride. And so these routes include the focus corridors, but then also additional corridors such as Eastway Drive, Providence Road, West Boulevard, and then also Arrowhead, just to name a few. All remaining routes throughout the network will have 30-minute or better service once Envision My Ride is fully implemented. And that is so that we can help eliminate the need for individuals to wait more than 30 minutes and make transit more viable for them to get to and from their destinations. In addition to that, through Envision My Ride, we identified additional crosstown connections. And so looking at how we can improve crosstown connectivity so that individuals don't have to go to uptown and then transfer back out to complete their trip. And so we've identified other crosstown routes such as W.T. Harris between J.W. Clay Station and North Lake Mall, Albemarle Road between Novant Health and 485, and then also Independence, Sugar Creek Road between the Derrida area and the Sugar Creek Station, and then also Waverly to Ballantyne, just to name a few of those locations. In addition to that, we also identified zones for where we could begin to roll out on-demand and microtransit to help improve first mile, last mile connectivity, and then also some of the neighborhood connectivity throughout the region as well. And so just to define microtransit, so this is a type of service that you can think of similar to Lyft or Uber. And so how it works is it's an on-demand system that you can request either through an app or calling customer service. And so how it works is you request to be picked up at a specific time, and then it'll drop you off either to connect to transit lines within a specific area or some other area destinations as well. And so the most key thing with microtransit is that it provides that important first mile, last mile connection for individuals, particularly in areas where we don't have fixed route service or where fixed route service doesn't make sense. This provides an alternative to help provide those connections and bridge that gap. It also acts as a feeder route to connect to high frequency service, particularly at the neighborhood level where we don't have good pedestrian connections, maybe because of the design of the street, or maybe it's hard to navigate out to the roadway by walking or traveling by other means. And so this can help supplement that by adding that on-demand service that'll pick you up designated stops rather within an area, and then connect you to those key mobility hubs and bus stops along the primary focus corridors, or priority corridors, I should say. And as I mentioned, these typically operate within a designated boundary. And then they also use a smaller vehicle than your standard 40-foot bus or larger vehicle that you see on a traditional bus route. And so these vehicles are similar if you're familiar with our paratransit services, or airport shuttles, or anything of that sort. It's a smaller vehicle so that we can navigate through those areas where a traditional 40-foot bus might not be able to operate. And so we have a couple of different use cases with this. And so how microtransit can work is it can either be a new service to provide those neighborhood circulations that I mentioned. So it would act more as a neighborhood circulator to provide that curb-to-curb access at designated stops, and then also connect you to important destinations throughout the area or the designated zone, and then also the high-frequency transit lines as well. In addition to that, providing that important first-last mile connection, particularly in areas, as I mentioned, where we don't have fixed route or fixed route may not be as productive. This is a way so that we can extend transit service and provide that on-demand microtransit service to connect individuals to fixed route solutions. In addition to that, looking at how we can replace maybe routes that have lower frequency currently. So for instance, some of the circulator routes that maybe have 45 to 60-minute wait times currently, offering this rather as another solution so that we can provide more frequent connections so individuals can access areas and frequent transit lines as well. And so with this and what we're asking for input through this round of recommendations, we've developed initial microtransit zones. And so what you see here on the map in those light pink areas are the initial boundaries that we've identified for the zones. And so based on based on the recommendations and based on this different use cases for microtransit, we developed different suitability zones based on metrics such as high population need for transit, lower potential rather for traditional fixed route transit service. And then we also looked at other things, including origin and destination points. So looking at specific destinations within a boundary, including employment opportunities, medical facilities, and other travel destinations as well. And then also looking at density for areas to help determine these zones. And so as I mentioned, we're currently presenting these zones to the public. And so based on your input, we'll begin to refine these recommendations and recommended zones so that we can continue to develop an operational plan moving forward. And so what you see here on the map, just to name a few of the locations, we've identified areas in the towns, including Huntersville, Cornelius, Davidson, Pineville, Mint Hill, and then also Matthews. In addition to that, we have other areas such as the Hidden Valley area, the Derrida area, Still Creek, Waverly and Ballantyne, and then also the area surrounding South Park, just to name a few of those boundaries. And then last but certainly not least, looking at how we can enhance overall experience. And so some of the recommendations centered around the bus stop improvements include making ADA improvements system-wide so that we can make sure that our stops are accessible for individuals needing to access our services. In addition to that, we're also looking at how we can roll out a new shelter product. And so this will look similar to if you're familiar with our Sprinter line on Wilkinson Boulevard and those shelters, it'll look similar to that. So looking at how we can roll out a new shelter product throughout the network. And then also, which we'll be focusing on tonight, looking at how we can improve and roll out those mobility hub recommendations as well. And so think of a mobility hub as a connection point between transit and other modes of travel. And so this will help you connect to opportunities such as rideshare programs, frequent transit lines, pedestrian opportunities, bike and scooter programs, and then also that microtransit and on-demand service I mentioned before to help improve that first mile, last mile connectivity. We have identified for Envision My Ride on the Bus Priority Study 3 different hub types for mobility hubs, and these include the enhanced stop, the mobility plaza, and then also the mobility center. And just to go through some of the features of each of these different tiers. So starting with the enhanced stop, So these are stops that will be applied along the priority network. So those routes that we've identified as a part of the future high frequency network, as well as the focus corridors. And how these work is they provide enhanced amenities for passengers. So new shelter products at the locations, and then also additional amenities such as wayfinding, real-time arrival information, and also additional features such as bike storage programs and trash cans as well. In addition to that, building upon to the next tier, we'll be looking at how we can roll out mobility plazas. And how these work are essentially where we have two intersecting bus routes. This helps to provide an on-street transfer experience for individuals that need to connect between the different bus routes. So as I mentioned before, these take advantage of signal priority by having far side bus stop placements after the intersection, so that we can get our buses through the intersection and drop off and pick up passengers without being held up at the traffic light. In addition to that, it builds upon some of the recommendations from that first tier by adding additional pedestrian and mobility solutions, crosswalk improvements, and then also additional wayfinding signage as well. And then last, we have the mobility center. And so think of these as something similar to what we have at our smaller community transit centers, such as Rosa Parks and Eastland. And then also what we have at our light rail stations, so the J.W. Clay Station, University City Boulevard Station, just to name a few. And then also our park and ride locations. And so how the mobility center works is it provides a dedicated space for our buses to have layover where necessary, but then also provides additional amenities for individuals so that they can make those important first mile, last mile connections. So we'll have appropriate space for individuals if they're traveling by rideshare, such as Lyft or Uber. We'll have space for microtransit and on-demand connections, and then also additional amenities such as off-board fare payment as well. And so think of off-board fare payment as something similar to what we have at our link stations with the ticket vending machine. So before you board the links or the light rail, you're able to buy your ticket at that vending machine. And so think of something similar to that, but just for the bus network at the mobility center locations. And so as we begin to build the network, just to connect the dots, so the primary goal is to have frequent transit options on the main corridor. So think of this as your Central Avenue, your Providence Road, your South Tryon. And so we'll have frequent high frequency transit, 15 minutes or better on these corridors. And so together, these will connect to mobility hub locations throughout the network to help improve those connections for individuals, whether they're traveling by bike, scooter, or making those pedestrian connections. In addition to that, being able to supplement that by providing that paratransit and microtransit service, so having dedicated space for those first mile, last mile solutions. And then also making sure that we have dedicated space for driving and rideshare programs, particularly at Park and Ride, so that they can access frequent service as well. And so just to wrap it up in summary with some timelines and next step. So we're going to begin to refine the recommendations based on public input that we're receiving currently. And so we're soliciting input from the public throughout the month of March. And so based on that, we'll begin to refine the recommendations before we present it to our governing board, the Metropolitan Transit Commission, also known as MTC, for final plan adoption in April and May of this year. And then we'll have the final report available in May of this year as well for review. In addition to that, we do have some ongoing outreach opportunities. So we did hold a pop-up event at the Charlotte Transportation Center in Uptown just 2 weeks ago on the 3rd. We're doing additional pop-up events at some park and ride locations beginning next week. So we'll be at the Huntersville North Cross Park and Ride, and then also Cornelius Park and Ride next Tuesday from 5 to 6 on the 22nd. And then on Thursday, the 24th, we'll be at North Lake Mall, and then also Huntersville Gateway. And then on Tuesday, the 29th, we'll be at the Albemarle Lawyers Park and Ride, which is at the intersection of Central and Lawyers. And then also we'll be at the Matthews and Park and Ride on that same day from 5 to 6. In addition to that, we do have the recommendations available on our project hub through the end of March. So you'll be able to look at the recommendations and then provide input through our online survey as well, if you were able to do that. And so just to give you an example of what that looks like. So if you visit our main website at ridetransit.org/envisionmyride. There you'll find a link to our bus priority hub, which is what you see here in this image. And if you scroll through the recommendations, you'll be able to get a closer look at some of the focus corridor recommendations, and then also the network recommendations as well, particularly with the microtransit and first and last mile connectivity piece. And so you'll be able to look through those. And then at the end of that, you'll be able to complete a survey where you can provide input to help us refine some of the recommendations, particularly with the first and last mile improvements and the focus corridor recommendations. And so with that, I will now turn it back over to Natalie so we can go through Q&A portion.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for that presentation. And like you said, that leads us to our Q&A portion of this virtual meeting. So first question, you spoke about the 6 focus corridors. What about the rest of the network?
Yeah, so just due to project scope, we were only able to identify recommendations for 6 corridors to start with, but the goal is to develop a capital program that we can begin rolling out throughout the entire network. So in those corridors that I mentioned, such as Providence, West Boulevard, and additional high frequency corridors. In addition to that, as I mentioned, we'll be rolling out signal priority throughout the network. So particularly at intersections that are managed by CDOT, our partner agency, and then also bus stop improvements and additional frequency improvements throughout the network. And so think of this as a total package. And so the goal is to provide frequent service, and then also provide those key connections so that individuals can access service. And that's where the microtransit and first and last mile piece comes into play.
Next question is, what are the next steps for this project?
Yeah, so we are currently in the public input stage, and so we'll be soliciting or getting public input throughout the month of March. Based on this input, we'll then finalize the recommendations before we present it to our governing board. And so once the plan is up for adoption and once it's fully adopted, we'll then begin to work towards an implementation strategy for how we can begin to roll out some of the improvements moving forward.
Great. Our next question from the chat, and if you're watching, feel free to type in a question there. Are you all getting articulated buses?
Yeah, so that's an ongoing conversation. I don't have the answer now, unfortunately, but that's an ongoing conversation that we'll be looking at, particularly on some of those routes such as Central Avenue. I know that's been a topic for some time where we've been looking at articulated buses. So that's an ongoing discussion. Hopefully we can get a better answer for you in the near future.
Great. Next question we have is, can you elaborate on microtransit and the mobility hubs and perhaps the connection between the two?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, think of microtransit sort of as Lyft or Uber. And so how it works is through the CATS Pass app, you would be able to schedule a ride for you to be picked up at a designated spot. So say I live in an area such as Hidden Valley, just as an example. So I might request to be picked up at a spot within the neighborhood and then maybe dropped off either to connect to Sugar Creek or the light rail station at Tom Hunter. And so what happens is I will walk out to that bus stop at that designated pickup zone. The vehicle will come pick me up and then drop me off at the light rail station so I can make that connection. And so as I mentioned, it's important because it provides that first last mile connectivity, particularly in areas where fixed route transit, just because of the size of the vehicle, wouldn't be able to feasibly operate. And so this is an additional solution that we can begin to roll out to help improve those connections so that we can make sure that individuals can access those frequent transit routes.
Great, thank you. And then can you talk about how people can get involved in this project?
Yeah, so if you visit ridetransit.org/envisionmyride, you'll find a link to the project page. And so once you explore the project page, you can go through the recommendations. And then also you can complete our online survey to provide input. In addition to that, you can always call our customer service line, 704-336-RIDE. If you need further walkthrough, if you need assistance exploring some of the recommendations, we can make sure that we provide accommodations for that. But that's the main way that you can become involved. And then also, if you have time to join us at some of those park and ride locations that I mentioned next week, we do have the dates listed on our website. If you're able to come out, and then you'll be able to speak with the project team to ask more specific questions, and then also provide input through comment cards that we'll have available then as well.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you to all of you for attending. Like Bruce mentioned, all this information is available on ridetransit.org/envisionmyride. And that concludes our meeting for today. If you have any additional questions, you can email teltransit@charlottenc.gov, or as Bruce mentioned, call CATS customer service at 704-336-7533.